Hey everyone, welcome back to Chat Sematary. It's been a minute, I think. I know I put out an episode since I've been in Seattle, but I haven't recorded anything. So we're going to see how this goes because I'm in a new space. And today I am joined by Travis Newton, and we are going to talk all about Stephen King's latest book, Fairy Tale. Travis, how are you doing today?
Very happy to be back. Thank you, Deanna. I'm glad to be talking about a brand new Stephen King novel.
Yeah, it took me a while to get through this one. As you know, I was struggling a little bit to find the time and energy to read 600 new pages of Stephen King.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a big book. Let's say that. I mean, I think the official page count is 608. So this isn't an it, but it's a pretty chunky book. I read it. Well, I didn't. I got the audiobook,
Okay.
And it was like 24 hours long.
Yeah.
So it was fairly substantial from a listening standpoint too. I figure the way we can do this is, because this is like a really new novel, I think maybe some people haven't checked it out just yet. Mm-hmm. Do you maybe want to do like a spoiler-free discussion of it first to just kind of give people an idea of what the thing is about and how we felt?
Yeah, I think that's a good plan because, as you know, I'm not used to being caught up and doing things right as they come out necessarily. I was very close for the last Gwendy's book, but since then I have caught up and I am looking forward to some movies. I know I also still have Mr. Harrigan's Phone to watch on Netflix, but
oh sure, yeah,
we'll do some spoiler-free segments on these episodes as I get them done a little closer to when things release. But Fairy Tale is not necessarily unfamiliar territory for King. It reminded me a little of, well, frankly, Mr. Harrigan's Phone, an apt pupil where you have this younger boy and an older man, and they are sort of becoming friends over kind of weird circumstances usually.
Yeah, well, I would say that the primary structure of the first half of the book is a boy and his dog story. That is like the primary dynamic. And yes, our young hero, Charlie Reed, who is 17 years old when the story kind of starts proper. There is sort of an extended prologue about Charlie's childhood
Mm-hmm.
and his interactions with his own father and his father's alcoholism and so on and so forth. But when the story really starts, Charlie is 17. I believe the year this is set in, when Charlie is 17 is the year 2013, which I think would make him born in 96, something like that.
Sounds about right.
So Charlie gets to know this old man that lives in a creepy old house and has a mean dog. Like this is what he and his friends grow up knowing about him. Like old Mr. Bowditch lives in that house. And the big, sort of first third of the novel is Charlie getting to know the dog. And through getting to know the dog, getting to know this guy named Adrian Bowditch, who is quite old and not in very, very good health. Mr. Bowditch has many secrets. This is like the big reveal of like, how does the supernatural factor in? Turns out Mr. Bowditch has been hiding quite a bit from his neighbors. And there's a reason he's so secretive. And there's a reason we sort of never see him go out. And there's a reason why we see, like a mysterious shed in Mr. Bowditch's backyard. It's a pretty interesting little turn here. I hesitate to describe really what happens from this point from a spoiler standpoint, since, this is what sort of leads us to the sort of more direct fairy tale aspects of the story.
Yeah.
But, suffice to say, there's another world.
I think that's fair for spoiler-free territory because the name of the book is Fairy Tale, so it's kind of expected that there's going to be this mystical kind of aspect to everything, and it's not unfamiliar territory for King in that regard either. We've spent so much time with The Dark Tower. If you're someone who has read all of King's stuff up until this point, or a good chunk of it anyway. I know some people just read The Dark Tower and read, sort of his more fantasy stuff, but don't read the horror stuff. So I think this is one of those books that has a good blend of genres in it,
Sure.
which King is really good at. He doesn't necessarily just strictly write horror stories. A lot of them are coming of age and horror. A lot of them are fantasy and horror. And you have a lot of different aspects to this book that it really felt like it was kind of in two distinct parts. You have everything that is happening in Charlie's daily life, and you see him at school, you see him when he finds Mr. Bowditch, how he kind of handles that situation. You understand everything that's going on with him and his dad. It's very sort of slice of life at the beginning of the novel, I think. And
yeah, like a lot of slice of life stuff that I don't think has huge repercussions later on
mm-hmm.
in the novel. Like I feel like this is going to be adapted into a movie. Like that's the plan for it right now. Like a director, Paul Greengrass, is going to make this into a movie. And I feel like this is the biggest section of the novel that they could sort of cut down in, you know, talking about like what happened to Charlie's family when he was, you know, in single digit age, and like the big fallout of that with his dad, and, you know, becoming addicted to alcohol, and, you know, his dad's job selling insurance, and, you know, his sponsor at AA and all this kind of stuff. It's like, you know, Stephen King loves to go on and on about that sort of backstory. And it helps us feel that Charlie is more of a complicated character than, than we would believe if we were just to meet Charlie as like this 17-year-old kid who hangs out with some friends who happen to be like bad influences. There's one friend of his that is a little bit of a delinquent. And when Charlie hangs out with him, we see Charlie sort of lean toward, you know, worse behavior. He's sort of a negative influence, but really Charlie isn't a bad kid. He's just malleable in the ways that young boys are, because the malleability of Charlie is something that extends throughout the whole book. Like the novel is about telling the story of Charlie becoming the person he's supposed to be based on the narrative he finds himself in. And that some of the narratives are like, is this what the fantasy world around him is dictating? Like, is this who he's prophesied to be? Because there is an element of sort of prophecy in the in the latter half of the book.
Yeah, I feel like personally I maybe could have done with the whole first half in Charlie's life and everything being a little shorter, just so we sort of get to this more mysterious part sooner in the novel. And it's not that I didn't like anything in particular, it just felt a little drawn out. There's this whole scene with him and one of his coaches, because he's a multi-sport kid, as some are in high school, and he just kind of walks out of practice one day, and it seems like a lot of time was spent on that. And I get that sports can be a big part of someone's life as someone who played sports in high school, but at the same time I was just like, okay, all right, we don't have to linger on this quite as much. And maybe it was just because it took me so long to read this too, because of everything I was dealing with moving and getting set up and everything. And
yeah, that part didn't feel so drawn out to me because I was consuming it quicker. You know, I had more time to listen to the audiobook. So that part didn't bother me. And I kind of liked Charlie figuring out the new balance in his life. You know, it's like, you know, now that I've met this really interesting person and this dog that I'm quickly growing to love as my own, like, you know, he decides like where his priorities are, and he decides, you know, over sports and, you know, something that he's really good at. He's actually quite talented as an athlete. He decides that he would rather spend his time, you know, taking care of the dog and making sure that Mr. Bowditch is cared for as well. And so magic stuff happens, to skip over some spoilers here. Charlie finds some really interesting information out, and Charlie goes to another world. All right. And then there's a big section of the book in the other world that I found really, really fascinating and loved. It's my favorite stuff in the book. And then the boy and his dog story, you know, of this boy and this dog traveling to another world and experiencing these sort of, you know, more grown-up versions of classic fairy tales, like that comes to a natural conclusion. And it's like, okay, the big source of tension in the story has sort of been resolved. And now there's this other section of the story that begins that felt to me like a YA novel, not necessarily in tone, but kind of in structure. You know, it's like a really different beast of a book once Charlie he's sort of put together with a whole new group of characters, and there's like an arena combat thing. And it's like, this to me feels like a YA thing. You know, it's like there's the evil overlord, and, the different groups of people brought together from different parts. I was like, what is this, the Hunger Games? It was my least favorite stretch of the novel because Charlie was not going anywhere new. He stuck somewhere for a long time. And I was like, this is all fine, but I was really looking for that section of the novel to resolve a lot more quickly than it did.
Yeah, I honestly wish I had read this under different circumstances.
It just may have been a bad time. Yeah.
The way I read is I typically get through things quicker than most people, I would say. So the fact that it took me literally a month to read Fairy Tale is like unheard of. I think I had already read like 50 books for the year before I moved, and that was like August. So sure. Usually I am much better at getting through things. And I think with this, it was just because of circumstances. And it's not that I didn't enjoy a lot of the content of the book. It was just very hard for me to get through at times because I was like, all right, I am too tired to focus on this the way that I want to be able to. And I some days just did not have energy to read.
But, speaking about your experience with the book is one thing. And of course we have to acknowledge like how our experience of literally just consuming the content affects our opinion of the content itself. Like that's inextricable. Like, if you walk into a movie theater in a really rotten mood, that's going to affect your critical opinion of the movie a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So for the spoiler-free folks, I feel like we should come to an assessment, a simple assessment of it. I'd call this a good book. I was not really enamored with the whole part where it felt like a YA novel where Charlie is in one place for a long period of time, meeting a whole new cast of characters and seeing politically like how this other world is sort of messed up, and there's a lot of like new lore that he learns at that time. And I just felt that section was lacking the core likable aspects of the first part of the novel, which again is a boy and his dog story.
Yeah.
And Stephen King makes you really love this dog.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a dog person, but the dog in this book, Radar rules. Radar is great.
Yeah. As someone who is currently dog sitting, I am definitely a dog person. So I very much enjoyed that part of the story too. And it felt like you said, part of that was missing during a good chunk of the story. And it does take away a little bit. And look, this is not my favorite King book that I've ever read. Also, by far not my least favorite that I've ever read. This one kind of fell somewhere in the middle for me. I would probably say, I liked this as much as I liked Revival or something like that. And, Revival was one of those books too for me where I read it and I think a lot of circumstances, it just didn't hit me as much as it hit some other people. And I was like, okay, maybe this is one that I'll have to revisit later down the line, because I definitely have a handful, at least, that I want to revisit at some point because of either time reasons or I had something else going on and I just couldn't focus on the book as much as I wanted to when I was plowing through all of these, And yeah, I think Fairy Tale is going to be one of those books for me. Not anytime soon because of its length, but at some point in the future, I'm sure I will try to revisit this one and, maybe get through it in a week instead of a month and see if that changes how I feel about any of it. But yeah, there were two very distinct parts to this story.
Did you like one part better than the other, or?
Yeah. So for me, even though I said some of the stuff could have been cut down a little with Charlie's life, I did like everything from the time he started to take care of Radar. Mm-hmm. Until he sort of figures out what's in the shed. And I thought a lot of that was like really, really great stuff.
Yeah, the slowly building mystery there is really compelling. I think this for me is a pretty darn good Stephen King book. I was worried about this because I knew the protagonist was really young. It's written in first person from Charlie's perspective. 9 years after, all these events happened to Charlie. So I think it's written that would make it kind of like 2023 when Charlie sits down to write this, chronicle of his time. And I worried Stephen King sort of inhabiting a younger persona. Like, is he going to be able to pull it off? Because Stephen King just sounds like an old folksy dude from Maine so much of the time. And I'm like, well, how, is he going to like, curb his old folksy isms? And for the most part, I think he does. It still sounds like King, but it's not so achingly Stephen King. And I like that it's not set in Maine. It's not set in and around any familiar locations for King readers. This is set in a place called Sematary, Illinois, initially.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I was really surprised that I found this as compelling as I did. It is a pretty solid dark fantasy and an examination of fairy tales actually using quite a bit of horror in their fabric to kind of tell their stories. Horror has been an element in fairy tales ever since fairy tales were invented. So his use of horror in this particular fairy tale, I think, is pretty well done. I do hope, Deanna, that when you revisit, if you revisit fairy tale, you can do so when you're not pressured to do so. And like, I don't know. I wish you had enjoyed it like I did. I didn't think it was like, it's not a great Stephen King novel, but it's a pretty darn good one. That's my thoughts on it.
There's definitely a bunch of stuff I liked about it. It just kind of came in bits and pieces for me, or, sort of chunks. Like I mentioned, that chunk of when he starts taking care of Radar, and then to when he sort of finds everything in the shed. And I did get less interested after that point, for sure.
Oh, okay.
At times, but it felt like it reminded me of Roland and Jake in The Dark Tower.
Yes, that I assume was that intentional. Like, I've never read any of the Dark Tower books, but I assume that was intentional. Because Charlie, when he goes to the other world, does carry a gun. And I'm thinking, is this the start of a gunslinger kind of tale? And it is to some extent, but it isn't so directly Dark Tower.
Yeah, and obviously I don't want to completely relate Jake to a dog, but maybe it's a little more like Jake in the Billy Bumbler, at times.
Maybe. I don't know what the hell the Billy Bumbler is because I've never read any Dark Tower books. But I think now is a good time to get into like spoiler stuff, because I'll tell you sort of like where my big divide in enjoying the book was. Like, there's just that big section I didn't really like, but I'm curious about your reaction to what happens after Charlie goes into the shed and disappears. Yeah.
So at first I was like, oh, is this just going to be a Dark Tower extension? Like, is he going to go to Midworld,
Yeah, that was my first concern too, because I was like, well, if I don't know any of the Dark Tower stuff, am I going to be able to enjoy this? Thankfully, it's not Dark Tower.
Yeah, and I would have been okay even if it had been the Dark Tower, but as someone who has read all of those books now, it felt like I just wanted him to do something different, so I'm definitely glad he did.
Yeah, full spoilers here. When Charlie goes into the well and he goes down this giant spiral staircase, he ends up in a world called Empis. And I really, really enjoyed the section of the novel where he's exploring Empis with Radar. Mm-hmm. And there's this big ticking clock to get Radar to this, time reversing sundial so that Radar does not die, and that dramatically is very compelling, because Stephen King is saying, look, I might kill the dog. And I'm like, no, Stephen, don't kill the dog. And he doesn't kill the dog. Thank God, because Radar's great. So the fact that like Charlie is able to sneak Radar into like this decrepit city that's like, guarded by a giant and has to get into the arena where the sundial is and all this sort of stuff, I found that deeply compelling. I love this section of the book.
Yeah, again, a lot of the stuff with Charlie and Radar is what really hit for me. But I think it was once they started to meet a bunch of people, I was kind of like, okay, but what about the dog? I just wanted more of Radar. And there's this whole sort of secondary storyline that comes in, I want to say, in the third act, basically.
Yeah, when Charlie is captured by the Night Watch, I think it's called, and he has to meet, the main bad guy, basically, who is basically, it's like any kind of like YA bad guy. And I'm like, this is fun, and then I'm learning more about like what happened to Empis and like why it's in such bad shape. But the fact that Charlie is not going anywhere, not exploring anything new, and he's like stuck in this dungeon basically for chapters upon chapters, and the dog is gone, the dog has gone elsewhere. And the whole time we're wondering, what's going on with Radar? Is Radar okay? I really hope Radar's okay right now. Yeah. And Charlie's just like, another day in the dungeon. And I'm like, get to it, man.
Yeah, I think that is another part that definitely dragged on too long, more so probably than some of the sports stuff and the earlier stuff that I mentioned. But for me, it was just like, it was so late in the book and we were introduced to so many new characters after only really having like 4 characters to focus on for the whole like first half or 2/3 of the book.
Yeah. No, I liked the especially the women that we meet in Empis, you know, the Dora, who's the shoe lady, and then we meet the princess, the goose girl, the princess, and then like her horse that she uses to speak through, which is a wild idea.
But that's part of the thing too. Like there were so many characters we got introduced to. I couldn't keep names straight even as I was reading it. And, you know, we're trying to talk about it now. And I'm just like, I can't remember any of these names because there were so many, especially once he is captured. And I was just like, okay, I think I would have liked these characters a lot more had, you know, he done a whole book on Empis instead of sort of doing this half and half thing. It was like, we kind of needed it to be one or the other, especially once Radar, frankly, drops off the radar.
Yeah. No, I think for Stephen King to take Charlie, imprison him, and basically force him to learn a whole bunch about Empis is certainly my least favorite section of the book, but also it's essentially doing the same to the reader. It's imprisoning the reader in one scenario and forcing a whole bunch of exposition down their throat. And I was not a huge fan of this section of the book. When they start to plan their escape from the dungeons, I was like, okay, finally. Like the book really picks up speed at that. And then it kind of, after that moment, has to really rush to the big climax. And I appreciate, you know, where they went in the climax. You know, they go to even another world, a world beyond Empis, where there is this place called the Deep Well. And there's this giant Lovecraftian god called Gog-Magog that lives in the deep well.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is pretty cool. I'm into this. And, you know, the whole deep well thing is a bit of a metaphor because at one point in the book, Charlie describes that there is a deep, dark well inside of him that he can access. And it's like, okay, yeah, I get it. You know, the metaphor works. And the fact that Charlie is undergoing this like strange transformation into like a fairy tale prince with like his eyes turning blue and his hair turning blonde. I like the fact that at the end of it, all that stuff stops. Like Charlie goes back to being Charlie. You know, his hair turns back to its normal color and so do his eyes. I like that he doesn't fulfill this role permanently as like the savior prince of Empis.
Yeah.
It's like, no, this is who this grand narrative needed him to be for a time. And now he can leave. I thought that was a really cool idea.
Yeah. I think it was kind of a roller coaster ride for me.
Yeah.
Because there were sections that I got through very quickly. And then there were sections where if I didn't read for a few days, it maybe took me a little longer to pick back up. And this was definitely one of those things, like you said, when they got to the escape, I very quickly finished like the last 100 pages of this book. I finished it, I think, in about 2 nights, which given how long it took me to read the rest of the book, reading the last 100 pages in 2 nights, I was like, okay, I'm kind of into this a little more now. And that's why I was like, you know, maybe under different circumstances, I would have picked up a little more out of this like I normally do. And I feel bad because I feel like it's a little harder for me to talk about the book because it did take me so long. Like by the time we got to Charlie and Empis, I was like, wait, what's going on? Like, what happened? Am I reading the same book? Like, it was something that was a little jarring for me because of how long it took me to get through it. I was just like, did I miss something? Because it's entirely possible. I have moments where I'll be reading something and it's like, I have read the words that are on the page, but absolutely none of them registered for like 3 or 5 pages. And then like...
Yeah, it's odd. You get into like a flow state of consuming but not retaining.
Yes.
And the same thing sometimes happens to me with audiobooks where it's like I know I'm hearing the words and I'm understanding them in the instant, but I like haven't turned on the retention part of the brain. And that happens with actual physical reading for me too, where I get into the flow state of, you know, speed reading of like getting the words, but you've been exhausted, you know. I feel like, you know, you gave the book as fair a shot as you could. Given the circumstances.
Yeah.
But and it just may not be your particular jam when it comes to Stephen King. I know I'm more a fan of his horror stuff than I am of his more fantastical stuff.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed a lot of The Dark Tower because, like I said, yes, that's his fantasy epic, but he does include a lot of horror elements in it. And, you know, I love it. Pet Sematary, those are two of my favorites. I really enjoy some of his crime stuff, like the Mr. Mercedes stuff and the hard case crime books as well. And
Sure.
sometimes things just kind of are the genres of stuff that I like, but don't hit me in the way I thought they would. And I think that's what happened with this. The book came out a few weeks after I had moved into my apartment, and I pretty much had most of the furniture and everything set up by then. But as you know, Travis, because you've been helping me with this, my audio and video setup has been kind of a nightmare because there's a lot of open space and also empty space in this apartment, because while I have furniture and stuff, I did not bring any of my posters, did not bring like anything to put on the walls, essentially.
Yeah.
Did not bring my bookshelves. I had 5 bookshelves where I was.
I think what this kind of proves to me is that Chat Cemetery as an experiment was equally about what it means to like go on like a reading marathon or like to set a reading quota for yourself, like especially an ambitious one.
Very much so.
The experience of Chat Cemetery is really only half about the media itself and more about the experience of like, oh, did I get the time? You know, because I gave myself so little time to do this, like, did I give myself the time to really appreciate this? Or like, what is it like to read all this stuff in such a compressed period of time where, you know, we have normal life outside this, you know, life goes on, you know, my podcast Genre Vision, it's like, that's not my job. You know, I have to fit this kind of stuff in, you know, catch as catch can. And so it's about the experience of like, how do I set aside time to do this, to set a goal to consume this amount of media, and then not only consume it, but consume it well enough to try to like talk about it in a critical manner. It's really hard, you know, and I think even now that you're sort of caught up with Stephen King novels, it's, you know, life still goes on and it's still hard to really sit down and dedicate that reading time. But, you know, as you and I as readers know just how valuable that is, and we go through phases with it, and I think that's normal.
Yeah, and to be fair, I don't think it would have mattered what book I was reading during this time period. The same thing would have happened with all of them if I had been reading a nonfiction book, which I actually was reading Creativity Inc. before the Stephen King book came out, and I just had to stop reading that. I was like, I cannot do 2 things. I barely read any comics while I was trying to read this. Like, it was not my usual consumption level. Sure, I've still been watching like movies, and I've been going on a Scooby-Doo journey with that stuff. But honestly, Scooby-Doo is so mindless in comparison to everything else.
Right, exactly. To sit down and read, you know, a 608-page book with the intention of like retaining so much of it, like not just for pure entertainment, but for the purpose of like critical dissection, like, yeah, it requires to engage a more active part of the brain. And in some ways it is more like labor. It is more like work instead of just consuming media for enjoyment. And that can cut into the enjoyment of these things as well. But, you know, being a dedicated reader, like, you know, my girlfriend is a librarian and a voracious reader. She has like reading goals that she wants to make. She competes with her friends on Goodreads like, to read as much as she can. And so if she starts a book and she hates it, she'll just keep reading it until it's done. She's like, finally, I can stop that bad book. Whereas like me, I'm like, if I'm halfway through a book and if it really sucks and I don't like it, I have better ways to spend my time, you know? It's that kind of dedication that it takes to do this sort of stuff that it is difficult. And that is something we got to recognize, because Chat Cemetery, like I said, it's just as much of a reading goal experiment or a marathon reading experiment as it is a podcast.
Yeah, I 100% started this selfishly just so I would get through all of Stephen King's stuff. And when I was looking at it, I was like, okay, there's no way I can do a book every week. So then I threw in the TV stuff and the movies as sort of buffers to help with the reading time.
Right.
And then, that works out well until you get to 6 seasons of The Dead Zone or 3 seasons of Under the Dome, and you're
good Lord, Deanna,
watching
good Lord.
those things while you are also reading, because there's no way you can watch 6 seasons of The Dead Zone in a week, So obviously that was a much more extended project.
Right.
So yeah, it was complete madness. And, I at least waited to move, not intentionally, but until I was already caught up, which was probably good.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, your next Stephen King novel, comes at a time when I feel like, you're able to enjoy the reading process a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, there is something to enjoy about the reading process, even if you're reading a book that you're not totally enamored with. Just setting aside that time for yourself and, relaxing and having the right lamp on and having the right blanket on the sofa. Reading is it's a sensory process that engages a whole lot more than just, your eyes. That's one of the reasons why I still prefer to read. If I am going to read a book, I prefer to read a hardcover of it, because the sensory experience of reading a hardcover novel is nicer. It's, there's a greater romance to it.
Yeah, for sure. And I still really loved a lot of King's character work in this, especially with Charlie, but even what he did with Mr. Bowditch, because when we first meet him, he's going by Howard,
Right.
And then we find out later that he has all of these secrets, and Charlie is kind of unraveling some of them on his own. But the fact that because Charlie found him when he had fallen and could not get up, and he really just took an interest in this guy who was otherwise pretty mysterious to everyone who knew he existed, essentially.
Right.
And just sort of that slow burn, too, in the first half of the book of Charlie finding all of this stuff out, because Charlie's no detective, obviously. He's a high school kid, but he's curious.
He's curious, and he is certainly exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
As the story goes on, he begins to perform like exceptional feats of like combat and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And part of that is Stephen King knowing that Charlie is an exceptional boy, but also, whatever mysterious forces are making Charlie the prince, are serving to make him more exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think the character work is really cool. My favorite note of character work actually in the audiobook was a really cool decision. There's a part where it's written from Mr. Bowditch's perspective. He's actually making an audio tape recording for Charlie to listen to upon his death. And guess who reads the part of Mr. Bowditch?
I have no idea.
It's Stephen King. So he uses his old Stephen King voice as Mr. Bowditch, cranky old Mr. Bowditch, who's having a heart attack while he records this, to do that part. And it's honestly pretty great. I loved it. I would recommend the audiobook for that reason alone. I actually really like Stephen King as a narrator.
I honestly wish I was more into audiobooks, but because I listen to podcasts all day for work.
Sure.
I feel like that would be even harder than finding the energy to read a book, because I'm just like, I don't want more noise in my ears right now.
That's totally fair. To give your ears a break that is understandable.
And look, like I said, I know I've been watching movies and like Scooby-Doo and stuff, but honestly, half the time when Scooby-Doo's on, I'm only half paying attention to it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, this is comfort media that you can wash the dishes to. Yeah.
Yeah, especially when a lot of it had been stuff I had already seen numerous times as a child. So it's like I knew the episodes front to back, and you don't have to do too much thinking when you're watching cartoons for the most part.
Right.
So
it's a comfort watch. I get it.
Whereas with Stephen King, if you like blank out for 2 minutes during an audiobook, you could miss a lot.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I'll fully admit, to most audiobooks I listen to, sometimes I'll get into like I'll be commuting and I'll get into like a highway hypnosis kind of mode where I'm just like fully on autopilot and I tune the book out. And that's happened. And I did rewind a couple of times. Like I've dozed off a little bit while reading some of it, but every time I do that, I know I've done it. So I rewind and go back. Mm-hmm. If there's ever anything I'm unclear on, I go back. Unless I've read the book before. So, but yeah, that is my experience with Fairy Tale, both as just a reading experience and as a story. And, like I said, I hope if you revisit this, that you enjoy it more on a second read, because I thought it was a pretty darn good time.
Yeah, I still liked it enough. obviously I liked it enough to consider revisiting it.
Yeah.
It's not something along the lines of Tommy Knockers or Dreamcatcher where I'm like, nope, I'm good. Thank you. Never again.
Yeah. No, I think this is better than say like Doom McKee. It's better than, and Doom McKee is a book that I'm like, that's all right. I reread Doom McKee.
Doom McKee surprised me with how much I enjoyed it the first time around.
It's another, like Fairy Tale, Doom McKee is another one of these Stephen King books. It's like, this isn't quite like other Stephen King books, is it?
Yeah. And I think that's why that one surprised me, because as you and some of the listeners probably know, I went into a lot of these books not reading what they were about, especially the ones that haven't had the massive adaptations like a lot of his early work, Carrie, Cujo, Pet Sematary, The Shining, so on and so forth. A lot of those were hard to not have some sort of expectation going into them, just because I had already seen some of the adaptations, or, like The Green Mile I had read before, and I think The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon and a few others, but there were some where it was like Doom McKee and I went in not knowing anything. Same with Revival, I would say too, honestly.
Sure.
And a lot of the hard case crime stuff, I was like, I know nothing about what's going to happen. And I just wouldn't read the synopsis for the books that I didn't know anything about, because I kind of liked keeping it that way. I was like, all right, I will leave this as is, and we'll just go in blind and see what happens. And I think doing it that way, honestly, gives you a higher chance of being pleasantly surprised by something.
Yeah, I would agree with that sentiment. It's always nice to feel pleasantly surprised and to go in with as a few expectations as possible. Like I made it a point not to read a synopsis of Fairy Tale before
Same.
getting it. I pre-ordered the book. I was like, well, I'm doing it for Chad Cemetery, so I got to read it anyway, And I would have read it, sight unseen, I think, even if I had not done it for Chat Cemetery. I was excited for this one in a way that I have not been excited for a Stephen King book in some time, actually. Because there have been some books, like The Institute. It's like, that's, what little I know about it, I'm like, I don't know if that's quite my jam. I may read that one day, but I can say that this, as a reading experience for me, was a good time.
Yeah, and there are some things where he's obviously rehashed some ideas and, changed them just enough. Like The Institute very much feels like a rehashing of Firestarter with different kids. You have moments in this that kind of remind you of Mr. Harrigan's Phone or Apt Pupil or something like that. Obviously, Apt Pupil has a very different outcome than a lot of his boy meets older man story,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this was still good. I'm not going to say I disliked it. There were some moments that I could have done without, for sure.
Yeah. I would describe it as uneven. I'll agree with you in that it is uneven. The whole section where Charlie is imprisoned and forced to fight, in the arena, I was like, I move on, give me what I liked.
Yeah. This probably could have been, I don't know, 50 to 100 pages shorter, maybe.
Maybe more.
Yeah, maybe.
But I like a lot of the textual stuff in Empus, like him sneaking through the city and like seeing how ruined it is and like seeing, destroyed gargoyles in the street and that kind of stuff. I was like, ooh, the whole spooky city stuff in Empus is kind of my jam. I was into it.
Yeah, I think that's my issue with some of the second half of the book. It's like I would have preferred it if we just like had a whole book on Empus.
Right.
And that a lot of that stuff could have been handled a little differently, because like I said, so much information was thrown at us about this world. And the Dark Tower, there are 8 dedicated Dark Tower books.
Right.
Plus numerous other King books that touch on the Dark Tower. So he's spent so much time fleshing out that world that you can really dig in deep with it. But this felt like he was kind of trying to cram it all into the second half of this book, because he doesn't have another book featuring Empus coming out.
Oh yeah. It's a lot. Even in, the rather sizable page count, it's still a lot to handle, because he decides to like dump it all on Charlie and us as the reader at once. Yeah. That's really my only, big complaint about the novel is that section. Other than that, I'm glad I read it. And I'm glad to be talking about it on Chat Cemetery today.
Yeah, same. I think I gave it a 3 out of 5 on Goodreads. It's probably more like a 3.5, but you can't do half stars on Goodreads, so...
Fair. I'd probably give it a 4 on first impression.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would ever give it more than that,
Yeah, same. And like, even if I do revisit it, I think some of the stuff that bothered me this time around will probably still bother me, but I might just simply retain more information on a reread, as you typically do.
Well, and as life circumstances change, maybe, the reading will be more enjoyable. It's all so circumstantial, the way that we bring these things into our lives. There's really no way to like objectively read something. There's only so many subjective factors that are going to influence how you feel about reading something.
Yeah. And I'm definitely one of those people who will force myself to finish a book most of the time, even if I'm not enjoying it. And
oh, yeah. I mean, this podcast forced you to do it,
Yeah, a lot of that had to do with the way I chose to do this. And
right.
But even if I was reading something that wasn't King, I'd probably still do the same, because I am one of those people who loves to finish things if I start them. And
sure.
I've been trying to ease myself off of that, because I would do it with TV shows too. Even if a TV show got like really bad and I was not enjoying it, I would still watch it because I felt the need to see it through to the end, because I had already sunk so much time into it. So I think I've kind of been trying to get into movies more, because at least that it's a few hours and you're out.
Exactly.
At most.
Yeah, you're done with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas with TV shows, I've watched stuff that's like 8 seasons long. And I'm just like,
the investment is so difficult.
That is so much. Yeah. And like, I started Succession. This is a little bit of a tangent here, but I am on episode 5 still. And a lot of that has to do with because October hit and I was like, okay, it's horror movie time to the max, right, more so than usual. So Succession kind of took a back seat. But at the same time, I'm like, I have 3 seasons of this to catch up on, and each episode is a literal hour.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time commitment. And don't get me wrong, Succession is good. I've heard it gets even better after the first handful of episodes. So I'm looking forward to finishing it at some point. But I'm trying so hard to just get myself to let go of things I don't like and just like set them aside. And thankfully, usually I'm pretty good at picking up other books that I'm pretty sure I'm going to like based on, like recommendations from friends, reviews from people whose opinion largely aligns with mine when it comes to reading horror, especially. So that's a little different, but a book is a big time commitment too. Like you said, the audiobook was 24 hours for this book. It was no small feat.
No, it was a lot of listening, but it was a listening experience I enjoyed. So there's that. And I, for people who like audiobooks, I would kind of recommend the audiobook version of this just because Stephen King gets to narrate a little bit of it. And I thought the narrator for the rest of it was really good as well. I think one of my last notes on it that I thought was interesting, this is another book where Stephen King has to sort of invent a language. Mm-hmm. And having come off, God, what was it? Lisi's Story. There was like so much gobbledygook gibberish in that book that just I hated. And overall as a book, I thought it was like, okay, it tells a really interesting story, but like the language he uses to tell that story, I found really grating very quickly.
Yeah.
Here, they get into some of the sort of made up language of Empus and, the slang of Empus, but he doesn't depend on it so wholeheartedly. And, in fact, he makes sort of a point of saying like Charlie can sort of speak Empusarian, but he has sort of a translation going on in his head. And he's sort of aware when, there's a direct translation between English and Empusarian and when there isn't. So it finds like substitute words. It's pretty cool. I liked how he handled that. I don't know how the hell they would handle that in a movie.
Yeah.
Because you have to be inside Charlie's head to know what's going on. But I thought it was a cool touch.
Yeah, I'm a little worried about an adaptation of this, but we'll see what happens.
I don't think I would enjoy a movie adaptation of this because I'm like, as soon as you abandon the boy and his dog stuff, I'm like, I would not want to see that movie.
Yeah, it'll sure be something when it comes out either way, but...
Well, if it comes out, it's in development, so who knows?
That's also very true. As we've seen, there are many things that have been in development in King World that have not come to fruition, unfortunately. But what do you think is next for you as far as your next read?
My next read?
Yeah.
Right now, I am reading Ray Bradbury's The Halloween Tree.
Okay.
Which I've read before. I just got done rereading Something Wicked This Way Comes, another Ray Bradbury. I'll probably just read some fun spooky season stuff, honestly. As far as new releases, I don't quite know. but I'm revisiting some Bradbury stuff, and that feels good.
Yeah, as I was saying with the move, I left a lot of books behind. I tried to bring a bunch of the horror stuff I hadn't read. So, like, I don't even have my Stephen King books here other than Fairy Tale and a couple of the nonfiction things that were not necessarily written by King, but are about King. And I think I have one of his collection of essays.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of it for the King stuff. So, I'm probably going to keep Creativity Inc. on hold. I think that's easier for me to do with nonfiction books because there's not like different plot lines to keep track of with that. It's
Right.
like I can pick those up a little more easily again. But I am probably going to stick with spooky season, but I think I'm going to start reading my Fangoria issues that I now have 17 of and haven't read a single one.
Oh, cool. Yeah, enjoy.
So, yeah, that's what's next until, King puts out another book at least.
Well, eventually we'll have that Pet Sematary prequel movie on Paramount Plus to look forward to. I know that's done. As far as when they want to release that, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I know that is done, and at least in terms of production, it's done.
Yeah, as far as episodes for this, I'm going to watch Mr. Harrigan's Phone soon. That's something that I've just kind of been waiting on getting my desk set up and everything. And I am looking forward to seeing if Salem's Lot ever sees the light of day. Keeps getting pushed.
Yeah, we'll see about that one.
Yeah, well, Travis, thank you so much for bearing with me while I spent a lot of time trying to get through this book and for carrying this conversation, frankly, because I had more trouble doing that.
No worries. We've all been a little frazzled, so doesn't worry me one bit. I'm really glad to have been back on Chat Cemetery. It's been too long.
I'm sure you will be back when I figure out what I'm doing for future episodes.
All right, sounds good.